First of all, welcome everyone this evening, and a particularly warm welcome to the members of the Cirencester Archaeological and Historical Society who are joining us this evening for tonight's lecture. Our speaker this evening is Professor Peter Sarris, who holds a chair in late antique, medieval and Byzantine studies at Trinity College, Cambridge, where he is also a fellow. Professor Sarris read modern history at Balliol College, Oxford, and in 1993 was elected to a prize fellowship at All Souls College, Oxford. He began lecturing at Trinity College, Cambridge in the year 2000, and he has held visiting fellowships at Rice University, Texas, and Harvard University. He's published extensively on the history of early Middle Ages, both East and West. But he is perhaps best known for being a leading authority on the plague of Justinian and the age of Justinian. And his latest book, Justinian, Emperor, Soldier, Saint, was nominated Book of the Year in 2023 by the Sunday Times, the Evening Standard, and the BBC History magazine. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Professor Sarris if he'd be kind enough to talk, and he's going to talk on the plague of Justinian and the end of Antiquity.
The Eastern Roman or Byzantine Emperor Justinian, the famous depiction of whom from the church of San Vitale in Ravenna, you see on the screen in front of you, has long been something of a preoccupation of mine, going back really to the first time I had to write an essay on him when I was a first-year undergraduate in Oxford back in the early 90s. My tutor at the time, having sent me the question, did Justinian ruin the empire he set out to restore? And in many ways, I've spent much of the subsequent 30 years or so of my career trying to answer that question and attempting to come to terms with the emperor and his reign and the circumstances in which he had to operate imperial power. As an undergraduate, I encountered Justinian from a primarily military perspective, thinking about him in terms of relations between Constantinople and the empire's great superpower rival to the east, the empire of Sasanian Persia or Iran, and also examining the impact of the emperor and his aggressive foreign policy on the various barbarian successor kingdoms which had emerged in the 5th century West after the Western Roman Empire had fragmented and eventually faded away. As a graduate student, I then attempted to come to terms with Justinian's overhauling of the Roman state by trying to place it in its contemporary social and economic context, drawing in particular on the documentary sources from Egypt and the legal and numismatic evidence for the empire at large. More recently, I've approached Justinian's reign from a more fully blown legal and increasingly doctrinal perspective, examining Justinian's contribution to the development of the medieval church and Christian orthodoxy. Now, over the course of the last 3 years or so, these interests came together, as Pat was alluding to earlier, when the advent of COVID essentially obliged me to set aside my main research project and instead find a lockdown project, a book I could write essentially at home, or at least on the basis of my own books. With the libraries closed, I had to find myself something I could write on the basis of my own resources. And so after some hesitation, I was persuaded to set about writing a biographical study of Justinian and his reign, which came out last year under the title Justinian, Emperor, Soldier, Saint. Now, in my talk tonight, I want to discuss a crucial aspect of Justinian and his reign, which I emphasize in that publication, and which has long been an interest of mine, and which I hope will be of intellectual interest to scientists as well as historians and archaeologists. That is to say, how the Roman Empire, over which Justinian ruled in the 6th century, found itself confronted and almost upended by a series of natural cataclysms and events associated with a sudden era of climate change, and in particular, the sudden arrival of an hitherto unfamiliar pandemic disease, known to historians as the Plague of Justinian or the Justinianic Plague. And I'll begin by giving some general context to Justinian for those who are less familiar with the historical background. The reign of Justinian has long stood out from the pages of ancient and medieval history for its energy, its ambition, and its drama. From the imperial capital of Constantinople, modern Istanbul, Justinian would rule over a vast domain, which at the start of his reign in 527 extended from Greece and the Balkans in the west to the deserts of Syria and Arabia to the east. The area in gold, the eastern Mediterranean marked on the map. It encompassed, as you see from the map, not only Asia Minor and Anatolia, but also the fantastically wealthy territory of Egypt, the most economically productive and sophisticated region of the ancient Mediterranean. Yet, for all its apparent grandeur, the empire that Justinian inherited in the year 527 was one haunted by a profound sense of anxiety, failure, and insecurity, which the new emperor was determined to address. A chief, although by no means the sole cause of anxiety to some, was that although Justinian claimed to be Roman emperor, sole heir and successor to the emperors Augustus and Constantine, his was now, as you can see from the map, a Roman empire that no longer embraced the empire's original heartlands of Italy, North Africa, Spain, and Gaul. Along with Britain, these lands had, as I alluded to earlier, been lost to direct Roman rule over the course of the preceding 5th century. Justinian, in short, ruled over a Roman Empire that no longer included even the city of Rome itself, although the city of Constantinople had since the 4th century been accorded the title of New Rome. Glorious and extensive as it was, the Roman Empire of Justinian's day was thus understood by many at the time to be a sort of imperial contradiction and paradox, a Roman Empire without Rome. And prior to Justinian's reign, chroniclers had begun to comment on this fact. In particular, the emperor's claims to universal Roman authority were now openly contested by many of the, from a Constantinopolitan perspective, barbarian rulers who had come to carve out autonomous kingdoms for themselves in the West across the years of political fragmentation and crisis associated with the 5th century. Now, in response to this, relatively early in his reign, Justinian would famously spearhead a major imperial reconquest of Africa, Italy, and ultimately parts of Spain. You see the areas reconquered on the map on the screen in front of you in purple. These campaigns began in 533 with the daring decision to send an expeditionary armada across the sea lanes of the Mediterranean from Constantinople to the Vandal Kingdom of Africa, these African provinces having been the wealthiest territories under the rule of the Western Roman emperors in the 4th and into the 5th centuries. With the rapid defeat in battle and then capture of the Vandal king Gelimer, the entire African kingdom passed back into Roman hands. The breathtaking success of this African mission would soon encourage Justinian to now direct his armies into Italy in a concerted effort to restore direct Roman rule over the ancient heartland of empire proper. This attempt, too, would initially prove largely successful. In Italy, however, Justinian's armies met more concerted resistance, and the result, some have argued, would arguably be to inflict much greater damage on the fabric of the reconquered territories, including the city of Rome itself, than the supposed barbarian invaders of the 5th century had ever managed. But by 540, Justinian's armies had successfully occupied Ravenna, from where the Ostrogothic king Theodoric had previously ruled over a separate Italian kingdom. An image, those of you reading the inscription will see the name Justinian above this mosaic image of the Ostrogothic king Theodoric. This is because when this image was being restored by Italian archaeologists, so imperial was it in appearance that they assumed this to be Justinian, and so they inserted the name Justinian above the mosaics. At home, Justinian would crack down on tax evasion by members of the senatorial elite who repeatedly schemed and plotted against him. And he also dramatically overhauled the inherited body of Roman law. His aim here was to impose order and clarity on the sprawling mass of legal texts upon which the administration and regulation of the empire depended, facilitating speedier justice and reforming the law to express one unified vision and will, that of the Emperor Justinian himself. And we find this new vision expressed in the great monumental legal works of Justinian's reign, his Codex, his Digest, and his Institutes. And crucially, so effective was this act of autocratic fiat and codification that it's now really extremely difficult to work out in any real detail what Roman law was like before Justinian's law commissioners got working on it, editing it down, recasting it, rephrasing it. The form in which Roman or civil law would survive into the Middle Ages and beyond, providing the common law of medieval Europe, is Roman law as it was redefined by Justinian's court. So the students in Cambridge today who have to study Roman law in their first year are studying Justinianic Roman law. Whilst locked in political conflict with members of the elite, many of whom resented his legal as well as his fiscal reforms, Justinian also attempted to appeal to the broader populace of Constantinople by investing in lavish building projects epitomized by Hagia Sophia, which until the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 would be the greatest church in Christendom. And we also see him engaging in prodigious acts of generosity and charity, primarily targeted at the urban poor. But above all, Justinian sought to recast the Roman Empire, transforming it into a much more fully Christian state in which religious outsiders, dissidents, and those deemed morally or sexually deviant were subjected to ever more draconian punishments. As churchmen deemed heretical saw their writings burnt on the streets and were themselves consigned to prison or exile, and as the emperor's many Jewish subjects found themselves openly discriminated against by state officials with active imperial encouragement, it would have become increasingly apparent to many contemporaries that the accession of Justinian had heralded the advent of a more intolerant age. Since the conversion of Constantine the Great to Christianity in the 4th century, for example, many Roman emperors before Justinian had legislated against pagan acts of sacrifice, particularly public pagan rituals. But Justinian, for the first time, made it illegal even to be a pagan, declaring that those who persisted in what he termed their insanity be exiled, while those who were found to have made false or only nominal conversions to Christianity could be killed. To some of his enemies, he was a demon. To some of his admirers, including the imperial church, he would be a saint. But to a broader body of his contemporaries, whether they viewed him as a holy emperor or a demon king, it would have been clear that Justinian was a ruler of remarkable vision and energy, one who reigned longer than any Roman emperor, with the sole exceptions of Augustus and Theodosius II, despite the constant clues and plots against him. Now, it's often emphasized that Justinian helped to lay the foundations for the world of medieval Orthodox Byzantium, as it took shape in the centuries ahead, ruled from Constantinople. In many ways, however, his achievement was much more fundamental than that. In his recasting of the Roman state as an Orthodox republic, as he describes it in one of his laws, Justinian ultimately laid the ideological and psychological foundations for medieval Christendom as a whole, as well as bequeathing a major legacy to the Islamic world that emerged in the Near East in the 7th and 8th centuries. In each case, the legacy of Justinianic law would inform how rulers interacted with their subjects, and in particular, how they treated religious minorities within their realms. So many of the great persecutions we associate with the world of Western Christendom, for example, were in a fundamental way informed by what we used to think of as the rediscovery and renewed application of Justinianic Roman law from the 11th century onwards. On a much more general level, through his energetic reform programme and no less energetic self-glorification, Justinian effectively recast what it meant to rule, providing a model of active statecraft to which future Byzantine emperors, medieval kings, and even Muslim caliphs and Ottoman sultans would come to aspire. On the screen in front of you, you have an Ottoman depiction of Hagia Sophia, now a mosque, but imagining the great statue which Justinian erected outside Hagia Sophia of himself on horseback, an equestrian statue was actually destroyed by the Ottoman conqueror Mehmed II, but which later Ottoman authors conjured up in their imaginations. Now, in the 530s, as I mentioned earlier, Justinian initiated a series of major military forays to the west, which would ultimately lead to the restoration of direct Roman rule over almost the entirety of the Mediterranean, turning it once more effectively into a Roman lake. And from a Roman perspective, it's control of the coastal zones that most mattered in terms of the geographical imagination. The ease of the initial conquests led some in Constantinople to dream of the restoration of Roman rule over the entirety of the territories over which the empire had once held sway. And it is interesting, for example, that we have both literary and archaeological indications that down to this period, the mid-6th century, the imperial authorities on the Bosphorus still made considerable efforts to maintain contact with former Roman territories, potentially as far afield as Western Britain, where imperial merchants are recorded to have brought Byzantine gold and silver in exchange for British tin, and where down to the 530s, some local potentates at least continue to use dating formulae and stone inscriptions, which they put up, recording who held office in the surviving imperial capital in Constantinople. So we have a famous inscription that survives in Wales, using the consular dating of Constantinople in the 520s and 30s. Our contemporary eyewitness accounts reveal, however, and no period of Roman history is as richly recorded in contemporary writings as the age of Justinian, that these years of maximum military ambition in the 530s would also be remembered as years of intense famine and hunger across Italy and North Africa, where Justinian's armies were on the march. A key figure, the contemporary historian Procopius, for example, who saw active military service within the Roman army in Africa and Italy, records how in southern Italy, as he marched through it, he saw the bodies of the starving peasants so emaciated that when they dropped down dead, the local crows didn't even bother trying to strip the flesh from their bones, because there was no flesh left to peck at. Now, warfare is almost always associated with famine. But there are fascinating indications that the great hunger which gripped much of Italy and elsewhere in the late 530s was not simply the result of military conflict, the requisitioning of supplies, and the miseries inflicted on the civilian population. Writing in the year 536, for example, the Roman aristocrat and courtier, Italian courtier, Cassiodorus, based in Ravenna, sent out orders that emergency food supplies be set aside due to poor harvests caused by a mysterious climate phenomenon that had served to block out or diminish the rays of the sun during the crucial summer months. For almost a year, he complained, the sun had seemed to be in an eclipse. We still perceive, he wrote, a kind of sea-coloured sun. We marvel that physical bodies lack shadows even at midday, and that the strength of the sun's fullest exposure attains only the dullness of a cooling tepidness. What a terror it is, he continued, to endure daily what usually frightens people only for a passing moment. What may produce fertility if the earth cannot warm? Likewise, our historian and military man Procopius wrote with respect to North Africa, where he was serving, of how it came about during this year in 536 that a most dread portent took place. For he wrote, "The sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon for the whole year, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it shed were not shed as is accustomed to give out." Writing in Constantinople, the scholar and bureaucrat John Lydus commented on the fact that for nearly a whole year again, what he perceived to be huge clouds of moisture or some sort of body had gathered into clouds, dimming the light of the sun, so that it did not come into our sight or pierce this dense substance. Indeed, perhaps most tellingly of all, across the global northern hemisphere, from Ireland to Japan, a whole series of contemporary chronicles record a blocking out of the sun's rays and other climatic anomalies, leading to harvest failure and famine, all around the year 536 to 537. In Ireland, for example, we hear of a failure of bread and an associated wave of starvation. The Chinese sources describe yellow dust or ashes raining down from the sky and bitter frosts ruining crops. And in Japan, an edict attributed to the great king Senka declared, "Food is the basis of empire. Yellow gold and 10,000 strings of cash cannot cure hunger. What avail 1,000 boxes of pearls to him who is starving because of the cold?" There's a very good and up-to-date summary of the literature on this climate anomaly of 536 to 7 if you go to Peter Frankopan's recent book, which has just come out in paperback, The Earth Transformed. Now, it is conceivable, and some have argued, that these sources are describing unrelated phenomena, which all just happen to take place at around the same time, from Ireland to Japan. It is not, however, very likely. Indeed, over the course of the last 30 years or so, there has been mounting scientific evidence emergent from the study of tree rings, ice cores, and other geological and scientific proxy data used to reconstruct climatic conditions, that the second half of the 530s witnessed not only a significant drop in temperatures across the northern hemisphere, but one of the most sudden and severe such drops in human and recorded global history, held in the advent of one of the coldest periods of the last 2,000 years. As a result, some scholars have come to refer to this period as the late antique Little Ice Age. This material is very fast moving, so this conglomeration of evidence I put on the screen in front of you is already out of date, but it gives you a sense of the sort of drop in temperatures that different scientists using different proxies have been able to reconstruct. The low points there being that period down to the beginning in the mid 530s down to the early 540s being seemingly the low point. The precipitous decline in temperatures which occurred across the northern hemisphere at this time, estimated by some as having been up to 2 degrees Celsius, may have lasted in some regions for over 100 years and would have far-reaching societal implications. As we're getting more sophisticated models, we're getting more regional variation coming up. And so I think in the Mediterranean region, the implication is of 10 years of very sudden disruption. It may be that these effects are more long-lasting as we go beyond the Alps and the Pyrenees further north. In North America, for example, the period of climate instability and associated famine appears to have sparked off widespread migration and the emergence of new types of village and settlement, which archaeologists and anthropologists have come to regard as the origin of the Pueblo societies that would henceforth dominate much of the region until the era of European settlement and conquest. In Scandinavia, it has been noted, a major shift in religious culture seemed to have taken place around this time, whereby the local populations seemingly abandoned the traditional worship of the sun and moon, and instead turned to what we now think of as the Norse pantheon. in the Eastern Roman Empire and the societies that surrounded it, this phenomenon was taken by many as a sure sign that the end of the world was indeed nigh, as many Christians had long predicted. This is a point I'll return to at the end. So what we might reasonably ask could possibly have caused so sudden and momentous a drop in global temperatures? Now, the answer here would appear to lie in an extraordinary series of volcanic eruptions from Central America to Iceland, but the Central American ones are the ones that are regarded by climate scientists as the most significant, which geologists have been able to date to around this period, and which stand out from the geological data as an era of almost unparalleled volcanic violence. These eruptions seem to have served to cast vast amounts of dust and debris into the air, creating a sort of enormous sulfuric acid aerosol veil in the stratosphere, the effects of which were seemingly discernible as far afield as Constantinople and beyond. This phenomenon, sometimes referred to in historical scholarship as the dust veil event, would clearly have significant implications for Justinian and his regime. It was perhaps with good reason that the contemporary historian Procopius would write that, in his words, from the time when this thing happened, men were free neither from war nor pestilence nor any other thing leading to death. Now, as I just said, of course, some regions would have been more adversely affected by this shift in hemispheric temperatures than others. In general terms, in areas that were already colder and wetter, such as much of northwestern Europe, agriculture became still harder. In more arid areas, such as the desert fringes of the Eastern Roman Empire in Syria, agriculture probably became easier. But around the Mediterranean core of Justinian's empire, the evidence would suggest that the agricultural disruption caused by climate change and hunger appears to have posed major logistical and fiscal challenges at a time when the emperor's armies were on the march and needed to be both paid for and fed. And taxation on cultivated land was really the basis of Roman taxation at this moment in time. It thus made the continuation and consolidation of conquest and the revival of Roman fortunes much, much harder. But importantly, the ramifications of this era of climate disruption are also likely to have fed into a still more ominous development, the advent of plague, the consequences of which would again be felt from Ireland to Iraq. Near the village of Barrington in Cambridge, at a site in Cambridgeshire, at a site called Edic's Hill, about half an hour's walk from my home, archaeologists and geneticists have discovered what is startling evidence for a series of convulsions that would serve to transform not just England, but much of Western Eurasia at this time. In the late 1980s, a team of archaeologists led by Professor John Hines from Cardiff excavated an extensive Anglo-Saxon cemetery at Edic's Hill, which appeared to date back to the 6th century. In 2018, a study of the DNA preserved in the human skeletal remains that had been found there revealed that many of those interred, including the woman and child in the same grave on the screen in front of you, had died of bubonic plague, a plague which the literary sources reveal had arrived in the Mediterranean in the Eastern Roman Empire of Justinian by the year 541. Now, the origins of bubonic plague can be traced back around 7,000 years, when it splits from a disease known to medical scientists and geneticists as pseudotuberculosis. By the Bronze Age, it appears to have been established in Central Asia, where it evolved a highly lethal and highly virulent strain, which would then become endemic to the rodent population of the region. The causative agent of the plague, bacterium Yersinia pestis, fatally infects the blood, and as a result can be easily transmitted to other mammals by fleas and similar parasites, desperate for new sources of nutrition after the disease had killed off their initial host. The bacterium can also be transmitted via soil, aerosol droplets, or the eating of infected animals. As a result, bubonic plague is capable of very sudden spillover events, whereby it can leap to other species, including, crucially, human beings. Indeed, patterns of human behavior and social development may have rendered human communities in the 6th century particularly vulnerable to outbreaks of this disease. For example, around the Mediterranean, many human sedentary communities, both in town and country, lived cheek by jowl with rats and other vermin attracted by their leftovers, waste, and stores of food. These rodents, too, were highly susceptible to plague and could easily pass it on to their human neighbours via fleas or lice. And there's a fascinating project now being led from the University of York, the Ratus project, sifting archaeological data to find rat populations across the late antique and medieval world. And they have quite good evidence for rat populations in places like Italy and the Balkans, which would be struck by this disease. Now, in its most common form, the bubonic plague is capable of killing a human victim in some 5 to 10 days, with over half of those who contract the disease likely to die of it. It is also capable of developing a pneumonic strain, which can be passed by breath droplets between human carriers. Such pneumonic plague kills almost everyone who contracts it and does so with much greater rapidity. The plague is thus capable of burning through and wiping out isolated communities that come into contact with it, whilst also being capable of spreading like wildfire between connected ones. And really, until the development of modern medicine, and specifically of antibiotics, it was probably the most deadly and terrifying disease known to man. Its signature sign being the painful black tumour or pustule, the bubo, which typically swells up in the armpit, neck, or groin of its victim as the lymph nodes become infected prior to recovery or death. Now, it is conceivable that bubonic plague had made its way to the Mediterranean from Central Asia in the centuries before the age of Justinian. A Roman medical author known as Rufus of Ephesus, for example, describes what sounds like a very similar disease in Syria and North Africa around the 1st century AD. Thereafter, there are some indications that the plague may have focalized, establishing a plague basin amongst the rodent population somewhere perhaps in East Africa. Certainly, a number of 6th century sources would expressly associate the origin of the plague, which would suddenly emerge in the 540s, with territory ruled by the Ethiopian kings of Aksum in East Africa, with whom the authorities in Constantinople were in very frequent political, military, and economic contact at this time, as a result of a struggle for power over control of Arabia with the Persians, which was taking place with the Red Sea and East Africa playing a vital part in this. The dimming of the sun and the precipitous drop in temperatures that occurred around the year 536, along with the advent of the bubonic plague around the year 541, would thus serve to totally transform the climatic and epidemiological circumstances in which Justinian, his officials, and his millions of increasingly beleaguered subjects found themselves. The arrival of the bubonic plague was probably the single most important event of the entire 6th century. And since the 1990s, historians and archaeologists have increasingly raised the question of whether the two phenomena were, in a sense, connected. It seems likely that they were, although quite how is not yet entirely clear, and we should note that the advent of the later Black Death was also preceded by an era of climate instability as well. One of the first people to seriously examine this possibility was a rather eccentric, he's not in the audience, but I'll recognise him, a rather eccentric archaeology correspondent attached to a UK newspaper, The Independent, by the name of David Keyes. Through his reading of the latest scientific literature, Keyes in the mid-90s was becoming aware, or the early 90s, was becoming aware of the mounting evidence for a dramatic drop in hemispheric temperatures around the year 536. Through his knowledge of more recent periods of history, He was also aware that such dramatic drops in temperature were often associated with volcanic eruptions, such as that which occurred on the Indonesian island of Krakatoa in 1883. And actually, in recent years, some volcanologists have been studying the climatic impacts of volcanic eruptions as a means of trying to develop some sort of technological responses to global warming. Accordingly, David Keyes began to go in search of evidence for 6th century volcanic activity. At the same time, he came across the literary evidence of the bubonic plague, on which I've just given my first seminar paper as a graduate student in Oxford. And as a result, David Keyes got in touch with me, and I became a sort of advisor and consultant for him on his project on this, which culminated in 1999 with the publication of his book Catastrophe, an investigation into the origins of the modern world, which he also turned into a TV series. Now, this book was very open. Yeah, it's a work of journalism, which effectively tried to explain all subsequent history in terms of these events. But David Keyes really made the first, or one of the first concerted efforts to draw together the climate evidence and that pertaining to the plague. On his model, the ecological disruption caused by climate change in the 530s is likely to have altered patterns of foraging on the part of plague-bearing rodents, who may thus have come into closer contact with human populations, most probably, to my mind, in East Africa, or perhaps elsewhere, allowing for the plague to suddenly make one of its fatal leaps from one species to another. And I think for the transmission of the plague via the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, Keyes's model remains still the best hypothesis that we have. But whether the sudden climate change of the 530s and the plague of the 540s, which would continue down to the 8th century, were directly connected or not, the effects of each would have severely compounded the problems caused by the other, and the effects of both would then have been made much worse by the ongoing warfare. Authors of the Middle Ages often referred to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, who killed with sword, famine, and plague. From the 540s onwards, the Empire of Justinian and the world beyond it would be obliged to contend with each of these horsemen simultaneously. The Justinianic plague, as it has come to be known, was first reported in our literary sources, as I mentioned earlier, at the Egyptian port of Pelusium on the Red Sea. On the map on the screen in front of you, I give you such evidence as the literary sources would suggest for how the plague may have spread. It's reported at Pelusium in 541. From there, it spread quickly east along the coastal road to Gaza and west to Alexandria. By the spring of 542, the contemporary literary sources record it had reached Constantinople, having spread through Syria, Anatolia, Greece, Italy, and North Africa. In Constantinople, even the Emperor Justinian himself is recorded to have contracted the disease before recovering from it, which was regarded by some as a sign of divine intervention. We may even have a series of coins depicting Justinian with a bubo in his neck, and then with the bubo disappearing, perhaps meant to convey the message to his subjects that the emperor's recovery would also be their salvation. By 543, it had struck both Roman and Persian-held sectors of Armenia in the Caucasus, as well as Gaul, modern France. It's recorded as far afield as Ireland by the following year. The sources record that the plague would continue, as I just mentioned, to recur down to at least the middle of the 8th century, and probably a bit later in the Middle East, and so would have had a cumulative demographic impact on the societies it struck, whilst also spreading further afield. The second great outbreak of the plague, which occurred in 558, for example, extended into the core Mesopotamian or Assyrian territories of the Sasanian Empire of Persia, which would also be struck by major outbreaks in the 7th century. Now, until comparatively recently, and certainly when I was a graduate student, the identification of the Justinianic plague as bubonic rested entirely upon the testimony of these literary sources, which frequently describe the appearance of buboes or swellings in the groins or armpits of its victims. And for much of the 1990s, the main debate amongst historians and scientists was whether we could really rely on these literary descriptions to provide a retrospective diagnosis of the disease, something to which many historians of medicine were deeply hostile. Any doubt over this identification, however, began to be laid to rest in the early 2000s, when, taking advantage of rapid advances in genomics, archaeologists and genetic scientists began to work together to look for traces of the ancient DNA of Yersinia pestis, the causative agent of the plague, in skeletal remains in early medieval burial sites. And this followed on from its identification in later sites associated with the Black Death, especially in London. As a result, from the early 2000s, fragments of Y. pestis began to be recovered from a 6th century burial site in Bavaria. First in 2014, and then again in 2016, the entire genome of Y. pestis was recovered and identified from there and from a neighbouring location, finally confirming the identification of bubonic plague. Soon, it was discovered in other early medieval contexts, in Spain, Valencia, and southern France. Crucially, as I referred to earlier, findings published in 2019 revealed that it had been also recovered from the 6th century burial site at Edic's Hill, where to date it has been identified in roughly 40% of the bodies from which aDNA has been extracted. It is possible that these deaths may have occurred in a single devastating episode, that we're waiting for an important study on this site by John Hines. In Edic's Hill, we should note, the scientists and archaeologists had tried to extract aDNA from all the bodies found at the site, and not just from multiple burials, which had been the technique primarily applied elsewhere. The impression, as it stands at the moment, is of an early Anglo-Saxon community where the impact of the plague was extremely severe. Now, the 6th century dating of the finds at Edic's Hill is very important, because no literary source firmly attests to the presence of this disease in England until over 100 years later. More recently, further identifications have been made in central Spain, in the vicinity of the Black Sea coast, in Slovakia, in the highlands of the Lebanon, and also in Jerash in Jordan. These various findings have allowed scientists to now chart the phylogenetic or evolutionary tree of the plague. And this is already massively out of date. It gives you a sense of where matters stood about 3 years ago. And what is interesting about this is that the Edic's Hill variant, as it were, stands at a very early stage within it. So that's Edic's Hill. You see how those other ones come off that same evolution of the Yersinia pestis. It's extremely early, given especially how out of the way Eastern England is. This is a very interesting finding. Now, as we get more findings, this model on the screen in front of you is getting much, much more complicated. But crucially, it is increasingly giving us evidence for the plague having existed at times and in locations for which we have no written evidence at all. And so this genetic evidence is really proving historically transformative, raising very major questions about routes and timings of transmission. I think, particularly on the basis of what seems to be being reported out of the evidence coming out of Jordan, it may well be that actually we probably had earlier on a series of earlier vocalizations of the plague in various locations in Western Eurasia, which are then simultaneously activated amid the climate disruption of the 530s, and so it sparks off and spreads from many directions. So it's entirely possible that the plague doesn't reach Edic's Hill from the Mediterranean. It may be coming, say, via the Baltic.
What does phylogeny mean?
It's like a family tree.
Sorry?
Like a family tree. Now, whatever the origins of the disease, The contemporary narrative sources available to the historian of the early medieval and late antique world and its surrounding territories, be they from east or west, written in Latin, Greek, Syriac, or Arabic, speak with one voice in describing the plague as having had a major and sudden impact on both urban and rural communities. Our contemporary Roman historian, Procopius, for example, was present in Constantinople when the plague first struck in 542 and had access to official records. And he describes how at one point it was striking down over 10,000 victims a day, with the dead being disposed of in mass graves in the sea and beyond the city walls. The Emperor Justinian, in a law dated from 542, referred to the encircling presence of death. Likewise, the contemporary Syriac churchman John of Ephesus, who was travelling from Alexandria to Constantinople by land when the plague first struck, witnessed what he described as villages whose inhabitants perished altogether. As he made his way through Syria, John describes passing houses and way stations occupied only by the dead, corpses lying in the fields and along the roadside, and cattle wandering untended in the hills. The late 6th century churchman Evagrius, whose own family was almost wiped out by the disease in his native city of Antioch, and who was himself struck by it as a boy, recorded that the plague, like the imperial tax assessor, returned on a 15-year cycle to persecute and lay low each new generation. On the borders of Syria, the Christian Arab poet Hassan ibn Thabit described the plague as the stinging of the jinn, devastating the rural population of the desert village. A high rate of mortality is also recorded with respect to Gaul or modern France in the writings of the contemporary Frankish churchman Gregory of Tours. And we also have references to high mortality events in the Irish sources. Throughout these areas, the plague would recur down to the mid-8th century. Now, to my mind, there is no good reason to gainsay these eyewitness accounts, which are written by different authors from different cultures at different points across this map and across the globe. But so many people from such different cultures were describing something in such similar terms would suggest to me they're describing the same thing. And these literary sources are increasingly receiving archaeological support from evidence from mass burials and other signs of disruption. Plague victims, I just mentioned earlier, for example, have been identified on the basis of genetic evidence from obscure rural sites along the fringes of the early medieval world, in England, in Bavaria, in France, in central Spain, in Slovakia, in the highlands of the Lebanon. These are places in the middle of nowhere. If the plague reached even these isolated rural communities, it is likely to have taken a much greater toll in the more densely populated, more heavily urbanized regions of the Mediterranean, and particularly the Eastern Roman Empire. As I mentioned earlier, a huge plague pit containing victims of the pandemic has recently been identified at Jerash in Jordan. Now, crucially, we now know on the basis of the genetic evidence that the 6th century strain of bubonic plague was very closely related to that which caused the Black Death. And we have no genetic reason to believe it was any less virulent or deadly. And current estimates for the Black Death, for which we have a richer documentary record, would suggest that it may have reduced the population of late medieval Europe by half. There is considerable evidence that high rates of plague-induced mortality disrupted military operations in the 540s and onwards. A sudden loss of taxpayers resultant from the plague can be seen to have wrought further havoc with imperial finances, obliging the East Roman state under Justinian to retrench expenditure on the civil service, to cut back on military pay, to debase the gold coinage. Crisis-driven measures would also have to be introduced to deal with the consequences of sudden labour shortages. From the 540s, the hitherto expanding empire of Justinian, in short, found itself rocked to its foundations. The optimism and hope for a more general Roman recovery, which had characterized much of the 530s, now began to give way to a more somber attitude as the imperial authorities were obliged to lock themselves into a dogged routine of survival. The advent of the plague thus arguably helped to close down the great era of imperial expansion and renewal of the early 6th century, as the Roman Empire reverted to a trajectory of a decline, which Justinian had seemed to be contesting and reversing. Now in Britain, where the arrival of the plague coincided, some would argue, still, with chronic military and political insecurity, the archaeological evidence points to a major thinning out of the population. Recent research by the Time Team archaeologist Florence Lewis is proving extremely thought-provoking here. At the end of the 7th century, the Anglo-Saxon church would effectively have to be reconstituted from scratch by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Theodore. Partly, it has been suggested, in response to the devastating impact of the plague on its administrative structures and personnel. Likewise, in the East African kingdom of Aksum, the second quarter of the 6th century, when the plague is known to be rampaging elsewhere, is precisely the period when the beginnings of Aksumite decline appear to be discernible in the archaeological and numismatic coinage record. Now, to some extent, the significance and impact of the plague would have depended on the degree of hierarchy and the balance of social forces within each of the societies it struck. Everywhere it struck, the bubonic plague was associated with a tsunami of human misery. But as with sudden climate instability, the more complex a society, the more structurally unstable demographic collapse threatened to render it. Comparative degrees of urbanization also mattered, as denser settlements facilitated contagion. In the highly urbanized world of the Roman Mediterranean in particular, the decades following the initial outbreak of the plague would be associated with growing fiscal instability, as the state found it harder to raise taxes. This in turn would fuel political unrest and a heightening of social tensions as the state tried to tighten the fiscal screw. In the early years of the 7th century, political instability associated with the downfall of the Emperor Maurice in Constantinople, who was unpopular in military circles due to his plague-driven economizing tendencies and austerity agenda, would open the way to large-scale Persian invasions. The warfare between Rome and Persia that ensued in the early 7th century would then leave each empire too exhausted to face down the forces of Islam as the Arabs advanced from northern Arabia in the 630s. Persia would soon be conquered in its entirety, whilst the Empire of Constantinople would prove itself incapable of holding on to Egypt, Syria, and Palestine, and was forced back onto the Anatolian plateau on which the medieval Empire of Byzantium would be concentrated. With the sudden emergence of Islam and the final destruction of the ancient polarity of Rome and Persia upon which the ancient world had rested, that ancient world was effectively no more. Indeed, historians have increasingly argued that the plague of Justinian may have played an important role in the rise of Islam and the rapidity of these Arab conquests of the 7th century in two crucial respects. Firstly, as I've just intimated, the plague is likely to have altered the balance of power between more hierarchical and urbanized societies and their less hierarchical and less densely urbanized neighbors, such here in the West, perhaps favoring Angles and Saxons over Romano-Britons, whose resistance to Anglo-Saxon expansion seems to have collapsed in the later 6th century, whilst crucially and more clearly in the East, favouring Arab tribesmen united by the nascent faith of Islam over both Romans and Persians along the desert frontiers, the desert fringes of Palestine, Syria, and Iraq. But secondly, and perhaps crucially, the plague may also have made an important contribution to the change in religious outlook, which also facilitated the emergence of Islam and the expansion of the faith. And here I want to finish with a few words considering the possible psychological and cultural ramifications of the plague. If attempting to assess the impact of sudden climate change and demographic cataclysm on past societies is problematic at the level of states, resources, and fiscal structures, then the impact of these same phenomena on the human psyche and at the level of imagination and belief is, of course, still more so. Yet I would suggest that no society can undergo processes of such sudden change without there having been a profound impact on the mindset and mentalities of those individuals and generations that were obliged to live through them. It is impossible, for example, not to sense the inner turmoil of those caught up in the plague of Justinian, when John of Ephesus describes how, when he was in Constantinople during the first outbreak of the disease, he would see residents leave their homes wearing armbands and tags bearing their names on them, so that in the event of their sudden death, they would not simply be left to rot on the street or end up in an unmarked or mass grave without their families knowing about them. Whilst no direct causal connection can be demonstrated, it is striking that from Ireland to Japan, the late 6th and early 7th centuries constituted an era of widespread religious transformation, which it is difficult not to read as to at least some extent informed by the bewildering natural circumstances and conditions in which people found themselves and of which they attempted to make sense. It is thus, I think, perfectly reasonable for a causal connection to be inferred. In the world of Europe and the Mediterranean, contemporary responses to plague can be seen to combine intensified Christian pietism and apocalyptic expectations on the part of some, with a rejection of Christian faith and an attempted reconnection to older religious traditions on the part of others. In Constantinople and the Christianized territories that surrounded the surviving Roman Empire, a heightened sense of the imminence of the biblically foretold apocalypse is certainly discernible from the late 6th century. It would inform propaganda disseminated on the part of the Roman Empire against the Persians in the early 7th century, for example, and crucially was at the forefront of the writings of both Pope Gregory the Great and the Frankish churchman Gregory of Tours in the late 6th century. Now, for partly technical reasons bound up with Christian theology and the emergent forms of Christian chronicle writing, the early 6th century had already been associated with a heightened sense of the imminence of the apocalypse. But objective conditions, including warfare, plague, and climactic chaos, now sent such expectations skyrocketing. In both Byzantium and Francia, moreover, it has been suggested that the impact of the plague may have informed more intensified devotion to the Virgin Mary, whom you see depicted on an icon from St. Catherine's on Mount Sinai, a 6th century icon on the screen in front of you, and who was strongly associated with healing. Now, it is crucial to note that in the early 7th century, Islam would take shape in a religious milieu strongly shaped by Christian apocalyptic expectations in particular, with Muhammad preaching submission Islam to the will of the one God, who had previously revealed himself to the Jews and Christians of the Near and Middle East, and whose final judgment of mankind was deemed to be imminent. Islam was itself, at least to some extent, clearly a product of such mounting apocalyptic expectations, which also perhaps informs the willingness of many early converts to accept it. In early Islamic tradition, interestingly, the region around Mecca, where the Prophet Muhammad initially preached, was regarded as being uniquely free of plague, whilst so as to encourage their armies to attack the plague-ravaged cities of Roman Syria, the compilers of these same traditions declared that, uniquely for a disease, death from bubonic plague granted the victim the status of a martyr, as if he had died in battle in pursuit of the jihad, thus giving him direct entry into paradise. Indeed, in many ways, it is in the early Islamic sources detailing the world of the 7th century that the plague of Justinian is at its most palpable and visible. And that may be telling us something very important about the historical and contextual consequences of a disease that almost killed one of the ancient world's greatest emperors in the form of Justinian and almost ruined the empire that he set out to restore. But the plague, along with the climatic disruption of the 6th century, clearly brought Justinian's efforts at large-scale imperial military expansion to an effective end, and arguably made a major contribution to the end of the ancient world and the dawn of the Middle Ages. It is so clearly imprinted on the landscape around us here in Cirencester. And I'd like to, with that, thank you for having listened to me tonight with such patience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm willing to answer questions on this. But I know I had a number of questions which occurred to me while I was listening, but you answered all of them about 2 minutes later, which is really remarkably good. So does anybody have any questions?
I recently read a book about Anglo-Saxon England where it mentioned that the plagues that occurred in the 7th century took a particularly heavy toll on priests. And I believe the same thing happened after the Black Death, where the mortality was sort of near 70% in priests compared with 50% in the general population. And in fact, Canterbury College in Oxford was founded a bit later specifically to try and increase the number of educated secular priests. Considering the important role that the priesthood played in education, have you noticed any effects on education going forward? I know Alfred was keen to improve the education of his priests as well, wasn't he?
Yes, I think both in an English context, it's also true in probably true in an Irish context as well. When thinking about the impact of the plague, we should be thinking about monasteries as often being sort of as urban, not urban phenomena, they are urban-like structures. You're getting denser concentrations of populations there. Yeah. So the density of populations in monasteries is likely to be the main factor why one seems to have such an impact on monastic institutions. In a landscape where, whilst there are new forms of urbanism emerging, we haven't got urbanism on the sort of scale as it had been in the Roman period and as it still survived around the Mediterranean. So this argument, it has been recently argued that as a result of this plague has a particularly disruptive impact on ecclesiastical structures in England in the 7th century, when we have this major outbreak of the plague in the 660s, which is when, for example, the Venerable Bede tells us how he was the only member of his monastery as a child who survives the outbreak. And so Theodore of Canterbury comes over, coming over actually from the Byzantine Empire, effectively has to reconstitute the Anglo-Saxon church in the context of that. Now, in many ways, one could argue that Theodore, who is a remarkable figure, he is himself a refugee from the Arab conquests. He was gradually moved from Tarsus west and ends up in Chile, Canterbury. One could argue that Theodore actually is associated with quite a major intellectual injection into the Anglo-Saxon church, as he brings a lot of learning from the East with him. But the impact on the church is certainly there. But I think it's not largely because of these monasteries being dense concentrations of populations, which makes them vulnerable.
Last rites must
that normally then people would expect to receive last rites from a priest. Must have meant that the priests were constantly going out and coming into contact with people at a highly infectious stage of their disease, and that could have increased the effect on priests even where they were fairly low percentage of the population.
there's, of course, at the time, no, people don't really have a modern idea of contagion in the sense that we would have it today. But Procopius is very interesting because he's in Constantinople when the plague is struck, and the imperial government makes a great deal of use of the church to try to minister unto the sick and also to clear out the bodies. The church sort of personnel in the streets of Constantinople. And what's interesting is Procopius records that because these priests and monks are going from door to door, checking on the sick and looking for the dead, they start to think that some of these priests are actually demons in disguise spreading the disease. They don't have a modern sense of contagion, but they're getting quite close.
Has anybody looked at the way that the rodents spread the disease throughout the whole of the land, and the way it was transmitted by rodents? Because a lot of them were on ships.
Yeah, there's a very high-profile book by an American ancient historian, Carl Harper, with The Fates of Rome, that came out a few years ago, where Carl sort of argues that, as it were, Roman imperialism and the investment, not just the trade networks, but also the investment in urbanism, as it were, creates the sort of perfect conditions for epidemiological catastrophe. But I say what I think is interesting is whether the written sources give one a map of the spread of the disease, which is largely really determined, it's determined by where you have literacy, so where you have, as it were, either surviving imperial structures or intellectual inheritance from empire, such as you have these traditions on the ground. What I think is really interesting with the genetic evidence is that it's transforming that map, and this is clearly moving across land masses, as it were, quite quickly, where we don't have Roman investment in forms of communication by land or by sea. So I mean, that is clearly an important part of it, but there's much more going on as well.
Hi, yeah, I've got a question about one of your earlier points concerning the expansion of Justinian's Eastern Empire. You mentioned the trade of Byzantine metal with British tin, and I know there's been a recent paper where they've analysed, I think, the Sutton Hoo treasure, and they've found that there's an important link. I wondered whether the Justinian Empire was at the time when that became to the fore, or was it already a general trading thing?
It's already a trading thing, which I think the East Roman authorities are trying to prop up in the first part of Justinian's reign. Procopius describes Angles and Saxons turning up in the court in Constantinople. We have a different body of literary evidence concerning economic contact between West Britain and the church in Alexandria, which has a major merchant fleet. There's a very interesting argument being advanced by Helen Gittos in Oxford at the moment, that some of these assemblages, the princely or high status burial sites we find at Sutton Hoo and what have you, could be the result of Anglo-Saxon princes and warriors going east and serving in East Roman armies, like a sort of 6th century version of the Varangian Guard, and taking this stuff back with them. Also, a very important study out by Rory Naismith and some colleagues reported this week, looking at how these treasures and assemblages, when the economy starts growing again, as the population levels start rising, and as you start getting economic expansion again, are then being melted down and recast as silver currency to help fuel an expanding northwest economy in England and in Francia. So it's operated at both levels. There's that sort of 5th into 6th century phase of this wealth coming into the region through trade with Byzantium, possibly service to Byzantium, different communities doing different things, and then, as I say, that wealth then being used as the plague starts fading away to then fuel the emergence of the new economic era that we see.
Any last question?
Just as off-the-cuff idea, it's always seemed strange to me how Islam seems to put more store in hygiene, particularly to do with eating, and I wonder whether that compares in an interesting way. A, in that it would give them more opportunity to win in conflicts, and also that might be a result of it having been developed at a time when the plague was happening.
That could certainly be true, that there could be a cultural impact there. What's very interesting with the Islamic medical tradition is that when the Black Death emerges, the Arabic author, medics and scholars say, we've seen this before. We have all this recorded from the conquest narratives from the time of the prophets. And so that for them, this is the same disease, effectively. And so they are very good at drawing the connections. The other interesting thing, which is partly related to that though, is that what we learn from different societies will treat their dead very differently. And this is very interesting in the context of the bubonic plague, because bubonic plague reduces corpses to such a horrific state. Yeah, really, you wouldn't really want anything to do with it. But it's striking that in Edict's Hill, although the mortality looks to be very large scale, the burials themselves are very careful. So it's a society that no matter what the horror of the event, it's got about the anthropology of death and the treatment of the dead in their society. You get a similar thing when the Black Death strikes Constantinople under the Ottomans. So whereas in Justinian's empire, we have reason to believe that the rate of the level of mortality of the Black Death in, say, the Justinianic plague in 6th century Constantinople and the later outbreaks of Black Death in Constantinople under the Ottomans are quite similar. Justinian, being very bureaucratic and efficient, just has mass burials, chucks them in the sea of the Tower of Galata, so on and so forth. Even in the context of a rate of attrition and maybe a third of the population dying, the Ottomans bury each individual corpse separately with full burial rights. So these diseases can be used to give one aspect into all sorts of aspects of the culture, anthropology, thought world of these different societies and religious cultures in many ways.
I think we are just very last question. Okay.
Is there any evidence that communities realize that by isolating themselves from the world at large, that they had a better chance of survival? Was there did they feel that the disease was resulted in contact with other people with the disease, or is this a fairly modern?
I think, as I said, there's that one business where in Constantinople, this account where they're almost getting there by thinking that the disease is being spread by these demons who are pretending to be monks who are going from house to house. Beyond that, there is an association between a belief that miasma spreads disease, hence an emphasis on getting. There's a belief that getting the dead off the streets is a very important public health measure. They think that you can get it from the stench, from bad humours and odours. There does seem to be a sense of that in terms of reactions.
Okay, I think we better draw it to a close there. I'd like to express our real thanks to Professor Sarris, because it's been a wonderful. So really, thank you. I've learned a lot, and as I said, I got lots of questions, but you managed to answer most of them while you were talking. So thank you.